Chapter 9. The Power of Spiritual Transparence. When we examine those conditions that are usually spoken of as evil and trace them back to their possible origin, or last analysis, it is impossible to find any actual evidence in support of the belief that evil is real, or that it is independent existence. On the contrary, all evidence is on the other side, and we are impelled to accept the idea that evil is non-existent. But the question is, why does evil seem to be real? And why is here affecting the life of man in such a positive manner? Deep thinkers in every age have given the larger part of their lives to these questions, and naturally various conclusions have been formulated. Among the best known of these conditions is the belief that evil is merely a condition arising from the misuse of the good. But in the full analysis of this belief, a difficulty is met with no other thinker along that line has yet to overcome. And it is this, that if evil has no real existence, there can be no natural evil in man. And if there be no natural evil in man, there can be no desire or tendency to misuse anything. But the good is misused, as we all know. Then from whence comes that tendency in man to want to misuse the good? Such a tendency cannot be good, and therefore cannot originate in the good. However, if all is good, where are we to find that from which a tendency to misuse can originate? There is a great difficulty here that must be overcome or explained if we are to demonstrate the belief that evil is merely the misuse of the good. But this difficulty has not thus far been explained, and yet when we examine evil closely we find that it certainly is non-existent. There is another belief, not so well known, that will prove itself far more satisfactory to the pure reasoner, and that will not only explain the various difficulties that are met with in its analysis, but that also presents a method for eliminating evil that is far more perfect than anything else ever conceived of by the mind of man. It will be interesting, therefore, to consider this belief, although it will be necessary to be brief, the subject being so large that a volume would be required for a full and complete elucidation. According to this new belief, evil is but a shadow that is cast by the life of man himself when he is in the light, and only when he is in the light, it being impossible to cast a shadow when in the dark. In other words, evil exists only as a shadow, it having no reality or permanency in itself. Thus evil is known only to those who have evolved sufficiently from the lower states of consciousness to have come up into the light, as it is not possible for those to know shadows who have never been in the light. If we are to accept this belief, and there is nothing to disprove it, while all the evidence obtainable is in its favor, we must in one sense rejoice in the fact that there is evil in the world, that our lives do cast a shadow, for this at least proves that we are in the light. But although we may rejoice in the fact that we are in the light, still we cannot rejoice in the fact that our lives do cast a shadow, and that these shadows have occasioned so much misunderstanding, so much stumbling, and so much pain in the world. We must find, therefore, the reason why the life of man does cast a shadow. When we go in search of this reason why, we soon discover that the life of man casts a shadow because the light does not pass through his life. His life is not transparent. If the light of truth and goodness and perfection, in brief, the divine light of being, could pass through his life, there would be no shadow, and man would not know evil in any form. This is self-evident, but before we can go further in the demonstration of this belief, we must find the reason why the life of man is not transparent. This is our greatest problem, and although the solution cannot be made so clear that it will be intelligible to everyone, still it is in our possession and can be proven by any thinker or spiritual insight to be the exact solution. The many, however, may not concern themselves so much with the reason why the life of man casts a shadow as they may with the finding of practical methods for the elimination of the shadow. And here this particular belief has a decided advantage over all others. It does present methods for the elimination of the shadow that all can understand and apply. The principle is that if the life of man is to cease to cast a shadow, his spiritual nature must become transparent. His life must attain unto spiritual transparence, and the way to spiritual transparence can be found and followed by an earnest, awakened soul. When we proceed to examine the problem of evil more closely, and from the viewpoint of this belief, we come to several self-evident conclusions. We find that the life of man does cast a shadow, that some lives cast a darker and heavier shadow than others, and that this shadow not only causes our minds to believe in darkness and evil, its presence being always with us, but it also gives origin to all the ills known in the world. This last statement may seem to be too far-reaching, but it can be proven to be true. When we look upon this shadow, our thoughts are created in the image of darkness, and any thought that is not created in the image of life must necessarily be an evil thought, a thought that will affect human life adversely. Such thoughts darken the mind, confuse the mind, misdirect the mind, and we have, in consequence, a number of mental actions that can only end in undesirable results. Thus, by thinking of the shadow, believing it to be real, the mind is prevented from doing all its thinking in the light. And here we find the final cause of good and evil in man. The good in him comes from his thinking in the light. The evil in him comes from his thinking in the shadow. And by following the shadow during a large portion of his daily existence, it is clearly evident, therefore, that if there were no shadow, all the thinking of man would be in the light. And as such thinking can result only in the good, there would be no further evil in his life or in his world. Our reasoning thus far is on solid ground, and our conclusion, as far as we have gone, cannot be gainsaid. But we still have to find the reason why the life of man does cast a shadow, or why the light of divine being does not pass through the human being. True, a number of the rays of that light do pass through the nature of many, but there are not a few who are approaching spiritual transparence, or who are on the verge of such transparent at frequent intervals. The lives of these are, at certain periods, almost like windows, through which we discern quite distinctly the majestic glory of the spiritual side of existence. That spiritual transparence can be attained, is being attained by a constantly growing number, we know therefore full well. But before this attainment can be completed by the few and made possible by the many, we must know the original cause of the shadow. It is evident that the life of man cannot become transparent so long as he thinks in the shadow. And he will think more or less in the shadow so long as he believes the shadow to be real. For the truth is that we shape our thoughts largely after those things we believe to be real. And also, what we believe to be real we make a part of our own minds. Thus the shadow has come into the minds of men, due to the fact that he has considered the shadow, believed in it, thought of it as real because it was always with him. But we can well understand that no mind can think clearly so long as there are shadows in that mind. Under such conditions, thinking would be confused, and it is impossible for the light to pass through a confused mind. Thus the mind, by believing in the shadow, and by making the shadow a part of itself, becomes instrumental in producing that very condition in the life of man that casts a shadow, or that prevents a divine light from passing through. In other words, the windows of such a mind will not be clear, and they will not transmit the light, and the atmosphere of such a mind will be shadowy and dense, so that the mental sky will be overcast more or less with dark and heavy clouds. The light, therefore, cannot pass through, and the light of that man will cast a shadow. From these facts we learn how man, through his recognition of the shadows, making it more or less a part of his mind, actually perpetuates in himself those very conditions that caused his life to cast a shadow in the first place. But why did his life cast a shadow in the first place? Simply because he did not understand the light when he first came up into the light. He came up from a simple state of consciousness, in fact from the darkness, and therefore could not think in the language of the light, the very moment he came into it. Man was not created a finished being. He was created with certain powers and possibilities, all of them marvelous and limitless, but he was left free to use his gifts in the making of himself, in the unfoldment of what was inherent in his nature, in the finishing of that remarkable piece of work that the Supreme had, through the laws of nature, begun in him. We realize, therefore, that man could not at first be in the spiritual light. He came up gradually into this light and earned every step of the way. But as he came into the light, he naturally would be ignorant of the nature of that light, and in consequence would form many wrong conclusions, which in turn would confuse the mind. And as a confused mind does not transmit the light, his life would at the very beginning cast a shadow. Besides, his mind would be literally filled with imperfections as he came up in the scale. In brief, he was, in a sense, crude in his mental nature when he began to awaken to his birthright. And a crude mental nature will not transmit the light, but will instead cast a shadow. We clearly understand, therefore, how the life of man came to cast a shadow as he began to rise from darkness into light. And we can naturally understand how this shadow came to attract his attention, how he came to think of it as real, and how he came to make it more and more a part of his own mentality, thereby confusing the mind and perpetuating those very conditions in himself which caused his life to cast a shadow in the first place. In this way, then, evil was continued, but it has continued only as a shadow and has caused pain and sorrow in the world in this way, that by attracting the attention of man, it has prevented him from doing all this thinking in the light. And thinking, that is not in the light will naturally produce conditions that are incompatible with living in the light. Wherever we live, all conditions must be in harmony with the sphere in which we live. If we live in the dark, all our conditions will be of the darkness and cannot confuse each other. But if we live in the light, we cannot permit conditions that come from the darkness, or there will be confusion and disorder, which means pain, sorrow, and tribulation. The problem of evil, therefore, resolves itself into this, that since man is now in the light, he must live wholly for the light, giving no thought whatsoever to darkness, or to the shadow that may follow his life for a time. He must begin now to think wholly in the light, and by doing this his mind will soon become so harmonious and clear that divine light will pass through. In brief, he will become spiritually transparent, and his life will not cast any shadow any more. If we are casting a shadow, be it very dark or very faint, we are obstructing the light to that extent, and thereby interfering with the best welfare of the world. Besides, we are not fulfilling our purpose in life, for we are not here simply to see the light. We must also transmit light. Therefore, to eliminate the shadow must become one of our leading aims in life. And to begin, we must consider the cause of the shadow first, and that means through which it may be removed. We find that the cause of the shadow is found in confused thinking partly in the light and partly in the dark. And we find that we think in the dark much of the time because we believe the shadow to be real. Therefore, at the very outset, we must refuse absolutely to think of the shadow as real. We must know that it is nothing but a shadow, and it will disappear the very moment we begin to think wholly in the light. In like manner, we must refuse to think of any evil as real in itself, coming as it does from no other cause than that of our believing a shadow to be a reality. In other words, we must take consciousness above and back of our usual mode of confused thinking, and begin to think only in the terms of light, knowing that the shadow, with all its train of shadows, are one and all mere shadows, not to be considered or recognized in the least. Then we must also know that when we begin to think wholly in the light, that entire train of shadows will disappear as completely as if there never had been such things in the world. In training the mind to abandon the old way of thinking both in the darkness and in the light, and to adapt the new way of thinking in the light only, we must mentally face the state of being which will be realized when the conditions desired have been attained. In other words, if we wish to eliminate the shadows, we must turn all the actions of the mind upon the state in which we shall find ourselves when we no longer cast a shadow, and that state is spiritual transparence. Our strongest desire, therefore, must be to become spiritually transparent. For as that desire becomes an active part in all the workings of the mind, every power in the mind will be directed upon the ideal of spiritual transparence. Accordingly, the entire mind will begin to transform itself into a finer and finer degree of transparence. For the law is that the mind invariably tends to become like that ideal to which all its powers are directed, provided all the actions of those powers are inspired with an invincible desire to attain unto that ideal. Thus, by placing spiritual transparence before our mental vision as the one supreme state we wish to realize, we cause everything within us to conform more and more with the law of transparence. In consequence, these conditions that obstruct the light will gradually disappear. Not being produced any more, the mental atmosphere will be cleared, and our thinking will become so clarified that every part of the mind will transmit all the light that may come upon us from higher realms. The result will be that more and more of the divine light will shine through our lives and nature. The shadows, therefore, will become less and less evident until they do not appear again. Then we shall be surrounded entirely by the light. We shall live in the full light. All our thinking will be in the light. And when every thought is born of the light in the light, there can be no evil, no sorrow, no wrong any more. Then we begin the emancipated life, the glorified life, the life we shall live when our eyes are stayed on Thee. When we live so deeply in the Spirit and in the truth that we know only that which is wholly, completely, and eternally of the truth. When we consider the lives of those who have lived largely, who have lived richly, who have lived beautifully, we find that they have invariably transcended the mere demands of the senses. They have taken higher ground. They have gone up into the lofty, the sublime, the empyrean, and have trained their minds to be in constant touch with the finer elements of the soul world. In consequence, their minds have continually reached out for those vast worlds that lie beyond the realm of sense, and in these worlds they have found a universe, the richness, the beauty, and the splendor, of which no tongue or pen can ever describe. There indeed have they found something to live for. In truth, they have literally revealed in gorgeous mansions of celestial luxury. They have not, however, lived apart from the world of things. On the contrary, they have lived more closely to things than before because they have learned to see the finer world in the all things. They have learned to hold that secret communion with the soul of nature's visible forms. They have entered into that sweet and strange relationship with the beautiful everywhere, which has always been the privilege of the great soul, and which has always added so much to the loveliness, the joy, and the real worth of life. When we have learned to live constantly in touch with that finer world, we have learned a great secret, a secret that will serve us wonderfully well whatever conditions may be in that external world in which we may now live. If we are bountifully supplied with everything in the visible and tangible, we shall be able to enjoy these things infinitely more if we can also see and appreciate the finer elements of worth and beauty which those things may contain. In truth, no one can enjoy the things that are seen unless he can also discern the glory and the splendor of the unseen. Then if all external sources of supply and enjoyment should fail us, as they sometimes do temporarily, where all is change and reconstruction, we need not be affected thereby in the least, if we are in touch with the greater good in the finer world. This higher source never fails, and we may draw upon it sufficiently to make life wonderfully rich and beautiful regardless of the absence or presence of external possessions. We may enjoy the finer things to the full whatever we may be, and he who enjoys the finer things to the full is living a life that is not only great and wonderful, but is also sublimely beautiful. We must not infer, however, that we need neglect the worthy and the beautiful in the external world in order that we may enjoy the greater riches of the finer world. On the contrary, we find that if we live largely in the world of finer things, it is a great advantage to give our attention to the perfecting and the beautifying of external things. Our great aim must be the best, the richest, and the most beautiful for everybody on all planes. But the finer things must hold the first place in all that we think and do, because the world of finer things is the richest world and the most beautiful world of all. Besides, it is only as we live for the finer things that we gain the power to enjoy the good and beautiful that may exist in all other things, and to rise perpetually into the purity, the light, and the glory of the finer world. This is how we attain to spiritual transparence. This is how we so refine and clarify the mind that the great light may shine through, and our own thinking and living will cast no shadow any more. End of chapter.